Chapter 3. In this chapter, we're going to learn about Vanguard. It's my favorite company for investments. And they use a very powerful technique called counter positioning. So, when Jack Bogle started Vanguard, at that time, active funds and companies like Fidelity and others were huge companies. And they took massive amount of fees, and they had products that were assets under management that were like big as 5 to 6 billions of dollars, right? Huge incumbents at which Vanguard was trying to aim at. So they use this powerful technique. This is one of the most important techniques of the seven powers of counter positioning. In counter positioning, what they did was they came up with a business model which was so superior, right? And totally counter to what Fidelity was doing. So they were like, we're going to track the market. So we will have mutual funds that simply track the market. So you don't need all kinds of actively managed portfolios and portfolio managers and all kinds of sales commissions. And we'll keep the fees very low, and we'll pass on all the returns to our investors, right? So that was a very opposite counter business model than what Fidelity had. And so Fidelity, if you see, and this was based on this indication, right? This intuition that Jack Bogle had, which is like, hey, over long periods of time, let's say 5 years, index outperforms 88%, right? And it just goes up when you look at 15-year period. 92% of the time, the index beats active funds, right? So there are 100 mutual funds, 92 of them would be beaten by a mutual fund, right, over a long period of time. So with this intuition, he started with like, hey, we're going to have a business model that tracks very few index-based mutual funds, and then we'll have very low fees because we are removing all of the fluff around portfolio management, active trading, and fees, and transaction costs. Everything will be reduced, right? And so if you see, Fidelity at that time was huge, right? But this intuition got Jack Bogle to take this huge counter positioning approach to start Vanguard. And it took them almost 10-15 years to have critical mass. At Fidelity, they were huge, right? And for Vanguard, there were many big challenges. The incumbent was huge. There was all kinds of misinformation on how active funds are beating the index funds, and the channel of distributors had huge disincentives to sell passive managed index funds, right? Because then they don't need an active advisor. So there were a lot of big challenges. But at Fidelity also, they had the similar challenge, like this boat in this picture. For this boat in this picture, this is the Fidelity as a company, right? They're doing really well, but they have to keep, these two, they have to be careful with these two things. One is a whirlpool on the right, and one is this demon of serpent on the left, right? Any which ways they could be, turned into nothing, right? So the whirlpool on the right was Vanguard. They're gonna literally eat up their business with this low cost funds, right? Because that just reduces their actively managed fund fees and everything. And on the left, if they were to introduce some of this low cost funds, then they would eat up their own business. So they had this huge dilemma. So big incumbents in counter positioning power, they have this dilemma whether to face the whirlpool or face the serpent within. Right, and but at the same time, Vanguard had no less challenges. They had huge challenges around big incumbents with a lot of channel distribution and a lot of misinformation out there. But see what happened, right? For a long period of time, right, from 1975 to 1990, no traction at all, right? But like we saw in network effects, eventually the size also matters. So eventually they started gaining traction because they started beating active funds. And so it was evident that passive funds was the way to go. And at some point in 2020, they are 6.2 trillion, and they've already taken much larger asset under management than all other funds, right, individually. They're probably the biggest mutual fund provider. And they did this by striving. They had a lot of challenges. They stuck on, they kept their business model, they had the faith in it, they kept it. And huge kudos to Jack Bogle for introducing low-cost index funds as part of Vanguard. But there are a lot of dabbling and delays that Fidelity went through. And let's go through these four basic barriers that Fidelity, only recently, I think 2019, I believe, they launched F0, and which is zero cost mutual fund, right? Very recently, almost after 25 years, 30 years of Vanguard launching this, right? So what caused them so much delay? Why were they dabbling and not really going all in and attacking? Because Vanguard literally took the asset under management in a pretty big way. So first dilemma that Fidelity might have faced is this new thing that Vanguard doing, is it really a standalone opportunity? Is this really worth it? So they might have said, no, it doesn't cost, it doesn't have any, fees, or we'll not make any money, and it's just a distraction. It's not even worth. It's very small. They, remain small. So forget about it. That would have been the first decision-making point for the CEO of Fidelity. And the second point, when they started seeing, the market cap go up, they would be like, hey, 1990, 55 billion. It's no longer small, 50x from 1975 in a matter of 15 years. So then they'd be like, hey, should we reconsider? So the CEO might have gone up and said, okay, should we continue to milk our, active house of mutual funds, or should we cannibalize our business and take some risk and actually invest some of these low-cost index funds so that more investors can stay on our platform and invest and get the success that Vanguard would potentially have? At some point, that is just too hard of a decision. It's milking the existing cow that is cash rich is very, very easy, but at the same time, cannibalizing is a huge, dent. You would take dent in your business and profits immediately when you start cannibalizing with new business opportunities or new business models internally. Second time, they would have probably in 1990 said, hey, no, probably not big enough. We can't take $55 billion of hit in asset under management and all of that fees. It's just too much, right? And so at third time, they probably they started thinking 2005, it's huge. 55 billion became 1,000 billion, almost $1 trillion. This is a problem. We've got to look at it. So then they would have been under cognitive bias. Hopefully the CEO is like, hey, this is how the world works. They probably will stay at $1 trillion. We're already at $4-5 trillion. They probably never. This is, the way it works. Status quo is the best way to go. So, the cognitive bias made them slaves of history, is my guess, right? So again, 2005, they still didn't make the decision. Still dabbling, still delay. Almost 30 years gone and of opportunity. And then finally, even there's some sort of agency bias, right? At some point, maybe in 2010 or 2015, they're like, hey, we got to do this. But then the CEO would have to, is measured potentially also in the short term and the long term. But the short term had a huge impact potentially. So the agency bias of job security versus doing the maximum good for the company may be at play. So that again would have probably deterred them until 2019, which is like almost 40, 50 years after which Vanguard did this. Is that much of dabbling is just not possible to survive. And so that's where Vanguard took up, I think, these four issues around not seeing it as a standalone opportunity, seeing that cannibalization is just not worth it, just continue focus on where we are, cognitive bias, like, hey, this is how the world works and active management is the way to go, and then agency bias and making decisions that counter to your short-term performance. Same thing would have happened with Netflix. But remember, we saw in the previous video, Netflix pivoted. They went from online DVD rental to streaming. That was a big pivot. Then they went to exclusives. Then they went into originals. All of those pivots were needed. Similarly, even for LinkedIn, I'm guessing at various stages we had fixed cost model for jobs, and then we went for pay for performance. And so if we didn't do it, if we did not reinvent our own business model, someone else would disrupt it. Same thing happened with Vanguard. Similarly, Fidelity, at least in 2020, realizes that, hey, if we delay this further, we're just going to be game over. Right? Like Vanguard's going to take over. They just become so big, and then they have network effects, like we looked at in the previous video series as well. So they get all the benefits. So typically for a CEO, for the leaders, this is a pretty important concept to remember, that it starts with denial and ridicule the competition, and then eventually fear sets in, and then there's anger, right? Same for Nokia and Apple. At some point, Nokia CEO was almost angry that, hey, how come we are so behind? Apple came only in 2007 with their first launch. We're in 2012, and we still didn't, we still don't even have anything close. So it becomes anger, and then capitulation. You just lose the business, right? So hugely important for you and I as leaders to take some of these lessons from the history of how counter positioning can be a huge opportunity to disrupt yourself before someone else disrupts you, like Vanguard disrupted Fidelity. And again, Fidelity is still big, so I think they can still continue as long as they have now launched some of these zero fees funds. But look at this, right? This was from some time ago. Fidelity is 2.5 trillion, and Vanguard's already 5. And we saw in 2020 it's almost north of 6 trillion. It's already overtaken in a big way. So counter positioning business models with a much superior business model is huge to pay attention, and to reinvent yourself is very important. Not to delay, not to dabble is the biggest takeaway from this power from Vanguard. Thanks.